Hey guys, Assalamu Alaikum. Welcome back. I hope you're feeling settled, maybe under a warm blanket or just leaning back after a long day. Tonight, we're going to do things a bit differently. We're going to step back, way back, past the Victorian drama, past the dusty European courts, and even past the crumbling ruins of Rome. We're going back to the very first story, the story of Adam, peace be upon him. It's a narrative that's been told for millennia, but tonight we're just going to drift through it at a very gentle pace. So dim the lights, put your phone on night mode, and let's just wander through the beginning of the human experience. Before there were kings with questionable jawlines or queens with too many cousins, there was simply the will of the Creator. And the angels, who, let's be honest, had a pretty smooth operation going on, were told about a new project. Allah announced he was going to place a Khalifa, a successor or steward on the earth. Now, the angels, being ever observant and perhaps a little weary of how things usually go when free will is involved, had some questions. They weren't being rude, mind you. They were just wondering why Earth needed someone who might, cause a bit of a mess and shed blood, while the angels were already there doing a perfectly fine job of praising the divine. It's that classic workplace dynamic, where the veterans are a bit skeptical of the new hire before he even clocks in. But the answer they got was simple. I know that which you do not know. And that, as they say, was that. The process began not with a crown or a scepter, but with the very soil of the earth itself. Imagine every shade of dust, red, white, black, brown, gathered from every corner of the planet. This is why, according to the tradition, we humans come in so many different shades and temperaments today. Some of us are soft like garden soil, others are a bit more rocky. It's a nice way of explaining why your neighbor might be a bit difficult on Monday mornings. Adam was shaped from this clay, but he wasn't alive in the way we think of it just yet. He stayed in this form for a long, long time, just a silent, massive figure of clay, waiting for the breath of life. During this period, Iblis, who wasn't an angel but was hanging out in their ranks, used to circle this clay figure. He was curious, sure, but also a bit smug. He'd look at this hollow form and think, I can overcome this. It was the ultimate I'm better than the new guy complex, and as we'll see, it didn't exactly end well for him. When the soul was finally breathed into Adam, starting from the head, the first thing he did was sneeze, and naturally he said, Alhamdulillah, all praise is due to Allah. It's a bit comforting to think the very first human act was a sneeze. It's so mundane, so relatable. From there, Adam was taught the names of everything, not just tree or rock, but the deep inner essence of all things. When the angels were asked to name these things, they couldn't. They realized then that this new creation had a capacity for knowledge and connection that was unique. Then came the moment that changed everything. The command was given for everyone to prostrate to Adam, not in worship, but in respect for what he represented. Everyone did it, every single angel, except, of course, for Iblis. He had that particular brand of arrogance that usually precedes a very long fall. He looked at Adam, who, remember, was made of clay, and looked at himself, made of smokeless fire, and decided the chemistry just didn't work for him. He said, I am better than him. It's the oldest excuse in the book, and frankly, it's a bit exhausting to think that ego has been a problem since literally day one. Iblis was cast out, but because he's nothing if not persistent, he asked for a reprieve until the day of judgment. He wanted to prove that Adam and his descendants weren't actually all that great. He basically signed up for a multi-millennial mission to be the ultimate hater. Meanwhile, Adam was settled into Jannah, paradise. It was beautiful, peaceful, and perfect. But even in perfection, there was a sense of something missing. One day, Adam woke up from a nap to find someone sitting near his head. It was Hawa, Eve. She was created to be his companion, his soulmate. When asked who she was, he knew because he had been given that gift of knowledge. He said she was Hawa, created from something living. And so, the two of them lived in this state of absolute calm. They were told they could enjoy everything in this vast, sprawling garden, every fruit, every shade, every stream. There was just one rule, just one: don't go near that one specific tree. Now, if you tell a human, especially the first humans, that they can have 99.9% of a garden but can't touch one single plant, you can guess where their eyes are going to wander. It wasn't that they were hungry. The garden was literal paradise. It was just the curiosity, and of course the fact that Iblis was whispering in the background like a very annoying, very dedicated radio station that you can't turn off. He didn't come at them with a pitchfork. He came with sincere advice. He told them the only reason they weren't allowed to eat from the tree was because it would make them immortal or turn them into angels. He played on their deepest desires. And eventually, in a moment of human forgetfulness, which is a much kinder way of putting it than a monumental blunder, they ate. The immediate aftermath wasn't some cinematic explosion. It was a realization. For the first time, they felt exposed. They began to cover themselves with the leaves of the garden, frantically trying to fix what had been broken. It's a very human moment, that sudden, cold realization that you've done exactly what you said you wouldn't do. But here is where the story of Adam differs from the tragic tales of the royals we usually talk about. In those stories, the protagonist usually doubles down on their mistake until the kingdom burns. Adam didn't do that. He felt the weight of it. He and Hawa turned back to their creator. They didn't make excuses like Iblis did. They didn't say, well, the snake told me to do it. They admitted they had wronged themselves and asked for mercy. And they were forgiven. But the consequence remained. They were to leave the garden and begin their lives on earth. It was time for the stewardship to actually begin. They were sent down to different locations. Some traditions say Adam landed in what is now Sri Lanka and Hawa in Arabia, and they had to find each other in this vast, wild, new world. Imagine that transition, going from the effortless peace of Jannah to a world where you actually have to find food, deal with the weather, and walk long distances. It was the ultimate roughing it experience. Eventually, they reunited at the plain of Arafat, a place of meeting and recognition. And from there, the real work of being human started, the farming, the building, and the growing of a family that would eventually lead to, well, us.
So Adam and Hawa are now on Earth. It's a bit of a downgrade from the literal gardens of eternity, but they're making it work. They've reunited at Arafat, and now they have to figure out the basics, like where to sleep that isn't a cloud, and how to handle the fact that, for the first time, they're actually feeling the passage of time. They weren't just the first couple, they were the first everything, the first farmers, the first builders, and eventually the first exhausted parents. Hawa began to give birth, and in a way that feels very let's populate the planet as efficiently as possible, she gave birth to sets of twins, a boy and a girl each time. The rule for the first generation was fairly straightforward. You couldn't marry your own twin, but you could marry a sibling from a different set of twins. It was a practical, if slightly awkward, genetic necessity of the time. Think of it as the ultimate keeping it in the family scenario, though far more necessary than the royal houses of Europe who would later do it just because they liked the look of each other's coats of arms. Enter the two most famous sons, Qabil, Cain, and Habil, Abel. Qabil was the elder, a man of the soil, a farmer who worked the land. Habil was a shepherd, tending to flocks under the open sky. They were different in temperament, as brothers often are. Habil was the gentle soul, the one who seemed to carry that quiet, reflective peace of his father. Qabil, on the other hand, was a bit more, let's say, prone to frustration. He had a bit of that, I'm the eldest, why am I not getting the VIP treatment energy. The tension started, as it so often does in these stories, with a marriage dispute. Qabil's twin sister was, by all accounts, quite beautiful, and he decided he wanted to marry her himself rather than the sister he was assigned to. It was a classic case of wanting what you aren't supposed to have, a trait he perhaps inherited from that whole forbidden tree incident. To settle the matter, Adam suggested they both offer a sacrifice to Allah. The one whose sacrifice was accepted would have the right of way, so to speak. Habil, being the sincere guy he was, went into his flock and picked out his absolute best, healthiest sheep. He didn't just pick any sheep, he picked the one he'd probably given a name to. Qabil, meanwhile, took a look at his harvest and picked out the shriveled, leftover grain, the stuff you'd basically throw to the birds. He figured it didn't really matter. They left their offerings on a hill, and a fire came down from the heavens and consumed Habil's offering, leaving Qabil's untouched. It was a very clear, very public rejection. Now, a normal person might take this as a sign to reflect on their intentions and maybe try a bit harder next time. But Qabil wasn't exactly in a reflective mood. His ego was bruised, and in that bruised state, Iblis found a very comfortable place to sit and whisper. The envy started to boil over. Qabil told his brother quite bluntly, "I am going to kill you." Habil's response is one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking moments in the story. He didn't square up or reach for a weapon. He simply said, "Allah only accepts from those who are mindful of Him. If you stretch out your hand to kill me, I will not stretch out my hand to kill you. I fear Allah, the Lord of the worlds." It was the ultimate non-violent stance. Habil wasn't being weak, he was being principled. He refused to descend into the cycle of violence. But Qabil, driven by a mix of insecurity and that toxic elder brother pride, eventually gave in. In a moment of absolute darkness, he committed the first murder in human history. And then the silence hit him. The thing about doing something that's never been done before is you have no idea what to do next. Qabil stood over his brother's body, and for the first time he felt the crushing weight of regret. He didn't know what to do with a body. He carried Habil for a long time, wandering aimlessly, not knowing how to hide his shame from the earth. Eventually, Allah sent a teacher in the form of a crow. Qabil watched as one crow killed another and then began to dig a hole in the ground to bury its companion. Imagine being the smartest species on the planet and having to take lessons from a bird because you've managed to mess things up that badly. Qabil cried out, "Woe to me! Am I not even able to be like this crow and hide the body of my brother?" He buried Habil, but he couldn't bury the guilt. He wandered away, separated from his family, becoming the first of those who walk the earth in a state of spiritual exile. Back at home, Adam was devastated. To lose one son to death and another to sin is a heavy burden for the first father. But life, as it does, continued. Adam and Hawa were blessed with another son, Sheth, or Seth. He was said to be the most like Adam in character and beauty. In many ways, he was the gift that helped heal the family. He became the one who would carry on the knowledge and the message of his father. As the centuries rolled by, and remember, back then, people lived for a very long time, Adam saw his descendants multiply. He saw the first cities begin to take shape, the first tools being forged, and the first hints of the complicated world we live in today. He spent his days teaching his children and grandchildren about the garden, about the mistake he made, and about the immense mercy of the Creator. He wanted them to understand that the world is a place of testing, but it's also a place where you can always turn back. There's a tradition that Adam was shown all of his future descendants. He saw their lights, some bright and some dim. He saw one particular light that was exceptionally beautiful, the soul of Prophet Dawood, or David. He noticed that Dawood was only destined to live for 60 years. Adam, being the generous father he was, offered 40 years of his own life to be given to Dawood. But when the angel of death eventually came for Adam at the end of his 960th year, Adam, ever the human, tried to argue. "Don't I have 40 years left?" he asked. He had forgotten the gift he'd given. It's such a perfect Adam moment, forgetting, just like he forgot the command about the tree. The angels smiled, reminded him of his promise, and he finally surrendered his soul in peace. He was buried, according to some traditions, in a cave or on a mountain, and Hawa followed him shortly after. They left behind a world that was now fully theirs, full of potential, full of struggle, and teeming with the humans who would one day build empires, write poetry, and eventually sit in their beds listening to stories about how it all started. Let's drift now into the aftermath and how the world began to change as the memory of the garden started to fade into the mist of time.
So, Adam has passed on, leaving behind a world that is no longer just a single family sitting around a campfire. It's starting to get a bit crowded. People are moving into the valleys, building more permanent structures, and generally doing what humans do, getting busy and occasionally forgetting where they came from. The memory of the garden, which was once a vivid first-hand account from Grandpa Adam, is starting to feel a bit like a legend to the younger generations. The world was still relatively pure, but the influence of Iblis, remember our dedicated long-term hater, was starting to pick up steam. He didn't just want people to do bad things, he wanted them to forget the concept of the divine altogether. He wanted them to get distracted by the shiny things of the world. And as the population grew, the simple monotheistic life Adam had established began to face its first real test, the test of boredom and innovation. Into this world comes Prophet Idris, peace be upon him. Now, if Adam was the father and Shith was the keeper of the flame, Idris was the intellectual. In many traditions, he is identified as Enoch. He was a man of firsts. It's said he was the first person to write with a pen. Imagine that. Before him, everything was oral tradition, just stories told under the stars. Idris decided to write it down. He was the original historian, the first person to realize that human memory is a bit like a leaky bucket, and we really ought to have a record of things. He was also the first to sew clothes. Before Idris, people were mostly wearing animal skins, very Stone Age chic, but not exactly comfortable or sophisticated. Idris brought in the needle and thread. He was the world's first tailor, turning rough materials into something refined. There's a beautiful thought in the tradition that with every stitch he made, he would say, Subhanallah, glory be to Allah. He was a man who turned the most mundane, repetitive tasks into a form of meditation. It's a nice reminder for us, sitting here in our manufactured pajamas, that even the simplest act of making clothes was once a prophetic innovation. But Idris wasn't just staying home and sewing, he was an observer of the heavens. He studied the stars, the movements of the planets, and the way time itself was structured. He was trying to understand the math of the universe. In a way, he was the first scientist prophet, blending deep spiritual devotion with an intense curiosity about how the physical world actually worked. He wasn't satisfied with just knowing that the sun rose. He wanted to understand the rhythm of it. Despite his brilliance, the world around him was starting to drift. To the south, in the plains, the descendants of Kabil were living a very different life. While the descendants of Shith were generally staying on the straight and narrow, Kabil's line had leaned into the more vibrant side of life. They had music, they had elaborate jewelry, and they had a lot of social drama. It was the first real culture clash in history, the people of the highlands versus the people of the plains. Iblis, ever the opportunist, went down to the people of the plains and showed them how to make instruments, flutes and drums. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a good beat, but he used it as a way to create a constant state of distraction. He turned life into a party that never ended, where no one had time to think about the creator or the purpose of their existence. It was the birth of hustle culture, but with more harps and fewer spreadsheets. Idris spent his life trying to call people back to a sense of balance. He was a man of immense wisdom, often speaking in proverbs. He'd tell people, the person who is greedy for the world is like a person who drinks seawater. The more he drinks, the more thirsty he becomes. It's a classic line, and honestly, it still hits pretty hard today. He was so beloved by the divine that he was granted a very unique end. There are various accounts, but many suggest he was raised to the heavens while still alive. In the famous night journey, Isra and Miraj, of Prophet Muhammad, SAW, thousands of years later, he would meet Idris in the fourth heaven. It's a fitting place for the man who spent his life looking at the stars and writing down the secrets of the world, just hovering there in the middle of the celestial spheres, quiet and observant as ever. After Idris was taken up, the world lost a bit of its intellectual and spiritual anchor. The gap between the good people and the distracted people grew wider, and then something subtle but dangerous happened. It started with the death of 5 very righteous men, Wad, Suwa, Yaguth, Yauk, and Nasa. These were guys everyone respected. They were the moral pillars of the community. When they died, the people were devastated. They missed their presence. So Iblis, who really deserves a gold medal for persistence at this point, showed up in the form of a helpful stranger. He suggested, "Why don't you make statues of them, just to remember them? You don't have to worship them. Just put them in your gathering places so you can look at them and be inspired to be good like they were." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a nice way to honor the deceased. So they built the statues. And for that generation, it was fine. They looked at the statues and remembered their teachers. But then that generation died, and the next generation came along. They saw their parents honoring these statues, but they didn't quite remember why. Then the third generation arrived. By now, the original purpose was a fuzzy memory. Iblis whispered, "Your ancestors used to pray to these statues for rain. These are your gods." And just like that, the simple monotheism of Adam was replaced by the first idols. The world had officially entered a new, much darker chapter. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the very geography of the earth. The air was getting heavy, the people were getting more arrogant, and a man named Nu, or Noah, was about to be given a very, very big construction project. Let's float over to the horizon where the clouds are starting to gather and a lone man is beginning to pick up a hammer.
So, the world has officially moved into its rebellious teenager phase. The statues of those 5 righteous men, who were once just harmless reminders, have now become the center of a very confused religious landscape. People are bringing them offerings, asking them for favors, and generally forgetting that their great-great-great-grandfathers used to just talk directly to the Creator. It's a bit of a mess. Enter Nu, or Noah. Now, if you're picturing a young, energetic activist, you've got the wrong vibe. Nu was a man of incredible, almost supernatural patience. He didn't just preach for a weekend or a decade. According to the tradition, he spent 950 years trying to get people to see sense. Think about that for a second. That is nearly a millennium of the same conversation. Hey guys, maybe don't worship the rocks? Followed by 9 centuries of people rolling their eyes and walking away. Nu was a soft-spoken man, but he was persistent. He tried everything. He spoke to them in groups. He spoke to them individually. He tried the soft sell by talking about the beauty of the rain and the stars, and he tried the hard sell by warning them about the consequences of their arrogance. But the elite of the society, the ones with the fancy jewelry and the most statues, weren't having it. They looked at Nu and saw a man who was followed by the lowly people, the laborers and the poor. To them, if the message didn't come with a high price tag and a social status upgrade, it wasn't worth their time. They even used to put their fingers in their ears when he walked by, literally. It's such a petty, childish move, but imagine doing that for hundreds of years. They would wrap their cloaks over their heads just so they wouldn't have to make eye contact. Nu was essentially being ghosted by an entire civilization. Eventually, Nu reached a breaking point. He realized that the society had become so toxic that even the children being born were being coached in arrogance from the cradle. He made a prayer, not out of malice, but out of a deep sense of, we've hit a dead end. He asked that the earth be cleared of those who refused to believe because they were only breeding more corruption. And then he got his instructions. He wasn't told to start a revolution or build a fortress. He was told to build a ship,
an ark. Now here's the kicker. Nu lived nowhere near the ocean. He was in the middle of a semi-arid landscape. So he starts planting trees, specifically oak and teak. He waits for them to grow, harvests the wood, and starts building this massive 3-story wooden structure in the middle of a dusty plain. If people thought he was annoying before, now they thought he was officially losing it. "Hey, Nu, where's the water?" they'd mock as they walked past. "Are you going to sail on the sand?" It was the ultimate insane neighbor project. But Nu just kept sawing and hammering. He was building the ark with the help of the angels, and every plank was a testament to his trust in a reality no one else could see yet. The ark was a masterpiece of ancient engineering. 3 levels, one for the animals, one for the humans, and one for the birds. It wasn't built for speed or aesthetics. It was built to stay upright in a world that was about to turn upside down. When the time finally came, the sign wasn't a massive thunderclap. It was something much more domestic. The tanur, a clay oven in Nu's house, began to gush water. When the oven, the very place of fire and dry heat, starts acting like a fountain, you know the laws of physics are taking a day off. Nu began to gather the animals, 1 pair of every species. It's a logistical nightmare if you think about it too hard, but the animals came in a state of calm, guided by the same will that guided the ark. Then came the small group of believers, only about 80 people after 900 years of work. It's a staggeringly low conversion rate, but as Nu knew, quality matters more than quantity. But there was one person missing from the boarding list, Nu's own son. As the rain started, not a drizzle, but literally the opening of the sky, and the earth itself began to crack open with springs of water, the world began to flood. Nu saw his son struggling in the rising water and called out to him, "O my son, embark with us and be not with the disbelievers." His son, still clinging to human logic in a moment of divine reckoning, replied, "I will take refuge on a mountain. It will protect me from the water." He thought he could outrun the inevitable. He thought he could find a high enough rock to hide from the truth. A wave rose between them, and he was gone. It's the most tragic moment in Nu's long life. He was a prophet, yes, but he was also a father. He cried out to his Lord, "My son is of my family," and the reply was a gentle but firm reminder. He is not of your family. His deeds were not righteous. It was the ultimate lesson that our true connections are built on shared faith and values, not just DNA. The world disappeared. The mountains were covered. The idols of the 5 men were buried under leagues of dark, churning water. The ark floated in a silent, watery void for months. It was just a wooden box carrying the seed of a new world, bobbing on the surface of a total reset. Eventually, the command was given, "O earth, swallow your water, and O sky, withhold your rain." The ark came to rest on Mount Judy. Nu stepped out into a world that was scrubbed clean. The air was fresh, the idols were gone, and the long 900-year struggle was over. He planted a vine, he thanked his Creator, and he began the process of starting over. From his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the human race would branch out again. The second Adam, they sometimes call him. He had survived the end of the world just to ensure there would be a beginning for the rest of us. Let's drift now toward the descendants of Nu as they spread across the earth, finding new lands, and unfortunately, finding new ways to get themselves into trouble.
So, the earth is dry again. The descendants of Nu have moved out from the shadow of Mount Judy and are spreading across the globe like ink on a damp paper. For a while, things are simple. But humans have a funny way of letting comfort turn into amnesia. We're going to look at 2 civilizations that were, quite literally, larger than life, the people of Ad and the people of Thamud. These weren't just your average ancient tribes. These were the overachievers of the post-flood world. First, we have the people of Ad. They settled in a place called Al-Ahqaf, which is basically the wind-curved sandhills between Yemen and Oman. Now, these people were absolute units. Historical traditions describe them as being incredibly tall and physically powerful, the kind of people who looked at a boulder and thought it was a convenient paperweight. They were the original giants. And because they were so strong, they decided to build a civilization that reflected that strength. They built Iram, the city of pillars. Imagine a city so grand, with columns so high, that it was said to be unlike anything ever created in the land. They weren't just building for shelter, they were building for the flex. They were obsessed with their own architecture. They would build high palaces on every hill just because they could. It was vanity and stone. But as their buildings grew taller, their hearts grew harder. They started thinking that because they were the strongest, they were the smartest. They revived the old habit of idol worship, because why talk to the unseen creator when you can carve a big, scary-looking statue that looks a bit like yourself? Allah sent to them a prophet from among their own, Hud. Now, Hud was a calm, dignified man who basically told them, look, you guys are living in literal sandcastles. This strength you have, it's a gift. Don't waste it on ego. He reminded them of Nuh and the flood, but the people of Ad just laughed. They looked at their massive arms and their towering pillars and said, who is stronger than us in might? It's the classic too big to fail mentality. When Hud warned them of a punishment, they looked at the clear blue sky and shrugged. Eventually, they saw a cloud approaching. They actually got excited. This is a cloud bringing us rain, they shouted. They thought it was a blessing for their crops. But it wasn't rain. It was a sarsar, a cold, howling wind that blew for 7 nights and 8 days without stopping. It wasn't just a breeze, it was a physical force that picked these giants up and tossed them around like hollow date palms. When the wind finally died down, the city of pillars was buried in the sand, and the giants were gone. To this day, explorers look for the Atlantis of the sands, but the desert keeps its secrets. Let's float over to the next group of overachievers, the people of Thamud. They lived in Al-Hijr, now known as Madain Saleh. They had seen what happened to Ad and thought, okay, the wind got them because they were out in the open. We're going to be smarter. We're going to carve our houses directly into the mountains. And they did. If you've ever seen photos of Petra, this is the same vibe. They took massive sandstone cliffs and carved intricate, beautiful homes and tombs right into the rock. They felt invincible. The wind can't blow a mountain away, they reasoned. They were wealthy, they were safe, and, stop me if you've heard this before, they were incredibly arrogant. Allah sent to them Prophet Saleh. Saleh was well respected among them. They actually thought he might become one of their leaders. But when he started telling them to give up their idols and care for the poor, they turned on him. They decided to test him. They pointed at a specific massive rock and said, if you're really a prophet, make a camel come out of that rock, and not just any camel, a giant 10-month pregnant she-camel. It was a gotcha moment. They expected him to fail. But by the will of the Creator, the rock split open, and out stepped a magnificent she-camel. She was a sign. She was so large that she would drink all the water from the well one day, leaving the next day for the people. In exchange, she provided enough milk for the entire tribe. The deal was simple. Let the camel graze, don't hurt her, and you're good. But the elites of Thamud couldn't handle it. The camel was a constant reminder that Saleh was right. She was inconvenient. So a group of 9 troublemakers decided to handle the problem. They hamstrung the camel and killed her. Saleh was heartbroken. He told them, enjoy yourselves in your homes for 3 days. That is a promise that will not be belied. The people of Thamud spent those 3 days mocking him. They didn't pack their bags. They didn't repent. They just waited. On the 4th day, there was no wind. There was no flood. There was just a saya, a single deafening blast or shriek from the sky. It was a sound so powerful that it stopped their hearts where they stood. The mountain carvers were found in their beautiful rock homes, fallen prone, as if they had never existed. The mountains remain today, quiet, beautiful,
and completely empty, a reminder that no matter how deep you carve your name into the earth belongs to someone else. Let's drift now toward a different landscape, where a young boy named Ibrahim is about to start asking some very uncomfortable questions about the stars and the stones.
So we've moved past the empty mountain cities of Thamud and the sand-buried pillars of Ad. The world is becoming a patchwork of different cultures, but unfortunately, the trend of carving gods out of rocks has really taken off. In the ancient city of Ur in Mesopotamia, this was the family business. Enter Ibrahim, Abraham. Now, if the people before him were defined by their physical strength, Ibrahim was defined by his mind. He was a thinker, a questioner, and, let's be honest, a bit of a troublemaker for the local establishment. His father, Azar, was a prominent craftsman who didn't just worship idols, he made them. Imagine being a child in a household where gods are just things you have to dust off or carve into shape with a chisel. Even as a kid, Ibrahim found this logically insulting. Ibrahim's search for truth is a beautiful, slow meditation. He looked at a star and thought, maybe this is my Lord. But then it set, and he said, I love not those that set. He tried the moon, too dim when the sun came up. He tried the sun, too gone by dinner time. He realized that anything that changes, fades, or is subject to the laws of physics cannot be the creator of those laws. It was the birth of pure, rational monotheism. But Ibrahim wasn't just a philosopher. He had a dry, sarcastic wit. One day, while the townspeople were off at a festival, Ibrahim went into the main temple with an axe. He didn't smash everything. He smashed all the small idols, but left the big one intact, hanging the axe around its neck. When the people returned and saw the carnage, they were furious. "Who did this to our gods?" they cried. Ibrahim, with the coolest head in history, pointed at the big statue. "Why don't you ask him? He's the one holding the axe." The people were stumped. They knew deep down that a piece of stone couldn't swing an axe, but instead of admitting they were wrong, they did what people often do when their world views are threatened. They got angry. They built a massive bonfire, a fire so hot that some say birds couldn't fly over it without being scorched. They threw Ibrahim into it. And here is the miracle that defines peace. Allah didn't send rain to put out the fire. He spoke to the fire itself. "O fire, be coolness and peace for Ibrahim." Imagine the onlookers' faces when the wood burned down to ash and Ibrahim simply walked out, not a hair on his head singed, not even smelling like a barbecue. It was the ultimate mic drop moment in prophetic history. But Ibrahim's journey was just beginning. He became a nomad, a traveler for the sake of his message. He traveled to Egypt and then to the barren valley of Mecca. He had a family, Sarah and Hajar, and this is where the story gets deeply personal. He was commanded to leave Hajar and his infant son Ishmael in a valley with no trees, no water, and no people. To any onlooker, this looked like a tragedy, but Hajar, with a strength that rivals any king's, asked, "Has Allah commanded you to do this?" When Ibrahim said yes, she replied, "Then he will not let us be lost." This is where we get the story of the Zamzam well. Hajar running 7 times between the hills of Safa and Marwa, looking for a sign of life, while the baby Ishmael kicked his heels in the sand. Where his heels hit, water gushed out, a spring in the desert, life where there should be death. Years later, Ibrahim returned to his son. They were no longer just father and son, they were partners in a grand design. Together, they built a simple, cube-shaped room, the Kaaba. It wasn't a palace for a king or a tomb for a pharaoh. It was a house for everyone, a place of return.
Ibrahim's life was a series of tests: the fire, the desert, the sacrifice of his son, which was replaced by a ram at the last moment. Each time he didn't argue, he didn't complain about the unfairness of it. He just leaned into the trust. He was given the title Khalil-Ullah, the friend of God. Imagine that. After all the kings who called themselves gods, here was a man who was simply a friend to the divine. He lived to be very old, seeing his sons grow into prophets themselves, planting the seeds for nearly every major story that would follow. Let's drift now to the descendants of Ibrahim, particularly to a young boy in a colorful coat whose story begins with a dream and ends in the golden halls of Egypt.
So, Ibrahim's legacy is firmly planted in the sand. His son, Ishaq, Isaac, had a son named Yaqub, Jacob, who had 12 sons of his own. And this is where the story shifts from the grand scale of nations and floods to the intimate, messy drama of a single family. Among these 12 brothers was Yusuf. Yusuf was, to put it in the most sleepless historian way possible, extraordinarily handsome. But more than that, he was his father's favorite, which is basically a manual for how to make your siblings resent you. One night, Yusuf had a dream. 11 stars, the sun and the moon, were all bowing down to him. His father, Yaqub, who knew a thing or two about prophetic dreams, told him to keep it quiet. He knew that the brotherly love in that tent was already on thin ice. But siblings have a way of sensing when something is up. The older brothers, fueled by a cocktail of jealousy and that classic middle child energy, decided they'd had enough of the favorite son. They didn't want to kill him, not exactly, so they settled on a compromise. They took him out to the fields, stripped him of his famous coat, and dropped him into a deep, dark well. Imagine being Yusuf, a young boy suddenly at the bottom of a hole watching the circle of sky above him get smaller as his brothers walked away. They went home with a blood-stained shirt and a fake story about a wolf, leaving their father to cry until he literally went blind from grief. It's one of the most heartbreaking family reunions that never happened. But Yusuf wasn't destined to stay in that well. A passing caravan stopped for water, found him, and, seeing a profit opportunity, sold him into slavery in Egypt. He ended up in the house of the Aziz, a high-ranking official. Yusuf grew up there, turning into a man so beautiful that, according to the accounts, when the local noblewomen saw him, they accidentally cut their hands with their fruit knives because they were so distracted. It's the ancient version of walking into a lamppost because you saw someone attractive. Then came the drama with the Aziz's wife. She tried to frame him for a crime he didn't commit, and Yusuf, choosing integrity over a comfortable life, ended up in prison. Now, most people would give up at this point. I was a favorite son, then a slave, now a prisoner. What's next? But Yusuf had this quiet, steady peace. He started interpreting the dreams of his fellow prisoners. Fast forward a few years, and the pharaoh is having some very weird dreams about 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 skinny ones. No one in the palace can make sense of it. The royal cupbearer suddenly remembers the guy in prison who was really good with metaphors. Yusuf is brought before the pharaoh. He doesn't just interpret the dream, he provides a grain management strategy. He tells the pharaoh that a massive famine is coming and that they need to save every scrap of wheat they can. The pharaoh is so impressed by this calm, intelligent foreigner that he makes Yusuf the minister of finance. He goes from a prison cell to the second most powerful seat in the most powerful empire on earth. And then the famine hits. It hits Egypt and it hits the land where his brothers are still living. They travel to Egypt to buy grain, and they end up standing right in front of the brother they threw in a well years ago. They don't recognize him. He's in Egyptian royal robes, speaking a different language, but he recognizes them. Instead of immediate revenge, he plays the long game. He tests them. He brings his younger brother, Benjamin, to Egypt, and eventually, in a moment of pure emotional release, he reveals himself. "I am Yusuf," he says. The brothers are terrified, thinking their time is up, but Yusuf, embodying that prophetic mercy, says, "There is no blame upon you today. May Allah forgive you." He brings his whole family, his father, his brothers, everyone to Egypt. Yaqub regains his sight when he smells Yusuf's shirt, a beautiful bookend to the tragedy of the blood-stained coat. The family is reunited, settled in the best lands of Egypt, and for a while there is peace. But as we know from history, the favor of kings is a fickle thing. The descendants of Yusuf, the children of Israel, would go from being honored guests to something much darker. The sands are shifting again, and a new pharaoh is about to arise who does not remember Yusuf. Let's float over the centuries to a time when the Nile would turn red and a baby in a basket would drift into the heart of an empire.
So, the golden age of Yusuf's family in Egypt has faded. The honored guests have become the labor force. A new pharaoh has taken the throne, and he's the type of ruler who is so insecure about his power that he decides to start micromanaging the birth rates of his subjects. He orders that every newborn boy from the children of Israel be killed. It's a dark, heavy time, but as we've seen in this long story, light has a way of finding a crack in the wall. Enter Musa, or Moses. His mother, desperate to save him, gets a divine inspiration that sounds, on the surface, absolutely terrifying. Put the baby in a basket and let him float down the Nile. This isn't exactly a standard safety plan, but she trusts. The basket drifts right into the backyard of the very person who wants the baby dead, the pharaoh's palace. Asiya, the pharaoh's wife, who, it must be said, was a woman of incredible grace living in a very toxic household, finds the baby. She falls in love with him instantly. She convinces Pharaoh to keep him, saying, "He may be a benefit to us." Little did Pharaoh know, this baby would be the biggest benefit to his ego's eventual downfall. In a beautiful twist of fate, Musa's own mother is hired as his wet nurse. He grows up in the lap of luxury, a prince of Egypt, but with the heart of his people. Musa's life takes a sharp turn when he accidentally kills an Egyptian overseer while defending a slave. He's forced to flee, leaving the silk robes behind for the dusty life of a shepherd in Madian. He spends 10 years in the desert, a decade of quiet, of tending sheep, of letting the Prince of Egypt persona melt away. It's during his journey back that he sees it, a fire on the side of Mount Tur. When he approaches, the fire doesn't burn the bush, and then he hears the voice. This is the moment of his commission. He's told to go back to Pharaoh, the man he fled from, and demand freedom for his people. Musa, being relatable as ever, is nervous. He points out his speech impediment. He asks for his brother, Harun, Aaron, to come along as his spokesperson. It's a very human moment. Even a prophet needs a wingman. The confrontation in the Egyptian court is the stuff of legends. Pharaoh, who literally thinks he is a god, is unimpressed. He throws his ropes, and through some clever illusions they make them look like snakes. Musa throws his staff, a simple piece of wood, and it turns into a real massive serpent that swallows all their illusions. The magicians, being experts in the craft, realize immediately that this isn't a trick, it's the truth. They fall into prostration right there, much to Pharaoh's absolute fury. Then come the plagues. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a systematic dismantling of everything the Egyptians worshipped. The Nile turned to blood, the frogs, the locusts. It was as if the earth itself was protesting Pharaoh's arrogance. But Pharaoh, being the ultimate example of doubling down on a bad hand, keeps saying no. Finally, the night of the Exodus arrives. The children of Israel leave under the cover of darkness, heading for the Red Sea. By morning, Pharaoh realizes they're gone and chases them with his entire army. The people reach the water's edge and panic. "We are caught," they cry. But Musa, standing with a calm that can only come from absolute trust, says, "No, indeed. With me is my Lord. He will guide me."
He strikes the sea with his staff. The water doesn't just move, it splits into two towering walls as solid as mountains with a dry path in the middle. They cross, thousands of people, animals, and memories, walking through the heart of the ocean. When Pharaoh tries to follow, the water loses its mountain status and becomes a sea again. In his final moments, as the water closes over him, Pharaoh tries to repent, but it's the repentance of a man who sees the check is due. Musa leads his people into the Sinai. It's a long journey, full of its own dramas, the golden calf, the manna and quail, the 40 years of wandering. It's a story of a leader trying to manage a people who had been broken by slavery and were struggling to learn how to be free. Musa passes away within sight of the Promised Land, a humble servant who stood up to the greatest tyrant of his age with nothing but a stick and a message. Let's float away from the desert sands and towards the hills of Jerusalem, where a king with a voice like a bird and a son with a ring that could command the winds is about to take the stage.
So, the era of the desert wandering has passed, and we've arrived at the golden age of the Israelite monarchy. This isn't your typical European royal court with damp stone walls and questionable hygiene. This is the era of Dawood, David, and his son Suleiman, Solomon, a time when the line between the physical world and the supernatural was as thin as a silk thread. We start with Dawood. Now you might remember him as the young boy who took down the giant Jalut, Goliath, with a well-aimed pebble. But Dawood grew up to be so much more. He was a warrior king, sure, but he was also the ultimate artist. He was given the Zabur, the Psalms, and it said that when he sang the praises of the Creator, the mountains and the birds would literally join in. Imagine a voice so beautiful that the very geology of the earth felt compelled to harmonize. He was also a man of his hands. He didn't just sit on a throne, he worked. He was a master blacksmith, and he was given a unique miracle. Iron would become soft like wax in his hands. He didn't need a furnace or a hammer to shape it. He designed flexible chainmail, the sleepless historian version of high-tech tactical gear, so his soldiers could move freely. He was a king who understood that true power comes with a craft. But then we move to his son, Suleiman, and if Dawood was the artist, Suleiman was the grand architect of the miraculous. Suleiman made a specific prayer. He asked for a kingdom that no one after him could ever possess, and he got exactly that. He wasn't just the king of humans, he was the king of the jinn, the king of the animals, and even the master of the wind. He had a literal flying carpet, or rather a massive wind-borne platform, that could travel a month's journey in a single morning. It's the ultimate avoiding airport security flex. He could talk to animals, too. There's a famous story of him leading his massive army, made of men, jinn, and birds, through a valley. He overheard a tiny ant telling its colony, "Get into your holes, lest Suleiman and his hosts crush you without noticing." Most kings wouldn't notice an ant, let alone listen to it. But Suleiman smiled. He thanked his Lord for the ability to hear the smallest voices. It's a nice reminder that the most powerful people are often the ones who pay attention to the details. Then there's the story of the Queen of Sheba, Bilqis. She was a powerful ruler in her own right, worshipping the sun in what is now Yemen. Suleiman sent her a letter, delivered by a hoopoe bird, because why use a messenger when you have a winged diplomat? When she decided to visit him, Suleiman wanted to show her that his power wasn't just about gold and soldiers, it was about the divine. He asked his council who could bring her massive throne to Jerusalem before she arrived. A powerful jinn offered to do it before Suleiman could stand up. But a man who had knowledge of the scripture said, "I will bring it to you within the blink of an eye." And just like that, the throne was there. When Bilqis arrived, she was led into a hall with a floor made of crystal, overflowing water.
She thought it was a pool and lifted her skirts to avoid getting wet. Suleiman gently told her, "It is a palace paved smooth with crystal." It was a moment of absolute wonder that led her to realize that the world she knew was just the surface of a much deeper reality. Suleiman's reign was of peace, building, and wisdom, but even he wasn't immune to the trials of life. He spent his final moments leaning on his staff, watching over the jinn as they worked on the temple. He passed away while standing there, but because he was propped up by his staff, the jinn, who are often depicted as being a bit terrified of him, kept working for a long time, thinking he was still watching them. It wasn't until a tiny termite gnawed through the wood of his staff and he fell that they realized the great king was gone. It's a quiet, slightly ironic end for a man who commanded the winds. It reminds us that even the most legendary figures are subject to the smallest things, a termite, a breath, a moment in time. Let's float away from the golden palaces and toward a quiet valley where a man named Zechariah is praying for a child, and a young woman named Miriam is about to receive a guest that will change the world.
So the golden age of the kings has passed into the archives. The grand palaces of Suleiman have been replaced by a world of Roman legions and local governors. The atmosphere is different now, more somber, more expectant. We find ourselves in the quiet corners of the temple in Jerusalem, where an elderly man named Zechariah, or Zachariah, is performing his duties. Zechariah was a man of quiet devotion, but he had a private sorrow. He and his wife were very old, and they had never been able to have children. In the logic of the world, that door was closed, locked, and the key had been tossed away. But one day, while he was in the sanctuary, an angel appeared. The news was almost too much to process. He was going to have a son named Yahya, or John. Zechariah, being a practical man, even in the face of the divine, asked how this was possible given his frail bones and his wife's age. The answer he got was a classic: "It is easy for me." As a sign, Zechariah was told he wouldn't be able to speak to people for 3 days, except through gestures. Imagine the local priest suddenly going on a forced vow of silence, communicating only with his eyes and hands. It was the quiet before the storm of a new era. In that same temple, Zechariah was the guardian of a young woman named Miriam, or Mary. She was no ordinary girl. She lived in a private chamber, and whenever Zechariah went in to check on her, he found her with fresh, out-of-season fruits. Summer grapes in winter, winter figs in summer. When he asked where they came from, she simply said, "It is from Allah." She was a soul so pure that the laws of agriculture didn't seem to apply to her. Then came the moment that changed the human story forever. Miriam had withdrawn from her family to a place in the east. An angel, Jibril, appeared to her in the form of a perfect man. Naturally, she was terrified, but he calmed her with a message. She was to bear a son, a spirit from God, and a word from him. His name would be Isa, or Jesus. Miriam's question was the same as Zechariah's. How? She had never been with a man. But the answer remained the same. Allah creates what He wills. When the time came for the birth, she went to a lonely place near the trunk of a palm tree. She was in pain, she was alone, and she was facing the certain judgment of a society that wouldn't understand. She even cried out that she wished she had been forgotten. But the earth beneath her answered. A stream began to flow at her feet, and the withered palm tree above her dropped fresh, ripe dates when she shook it. It's a beautiful, gentle image, nature itself acting as a midwife for the mother of a prophet. When she returned to her people carrying the baby, the accusations started flying. "Oh, Miriam, you have brought an amazing thing," they said, and not in a complimentary way. They pointed to her virtuous parents and asked how this could happen. Miriam didn't say a word. She simply pointed to the baby in her arms. And then the miracle happened. The infant Isa spoke. From the cradle, in a clear, steady voice, he announced his identity, a servant of Allah, a prophet given the scripture, and a blessing wherever he might be. It was the ultimate defense of his mother's honor. Isa grew up to be a man who walked the earth with nothing but the clothes on his back. He didn't build palaces like Suleiman or lead armies like Dawood. He healed the blind, he cured the lepers, and he even brought the dead back to life, all by the permission of Allah. He was a breath of fresh air in a world that had become obsessed with the letter of the law while forgetting the spirit of it. He sat with the poor, he spoke in parables, and he reminded people that the heart is more important than the ritual. But as we've seen with every prophet from Adam to Musa, the people in power didn't like their status quo being poked. They plotted against him, but Allah had a different plan. Isa was raised up, protected from their schemes, leaving behind a message of peace and the promise of a final messenger yet to come. The world was now waiting. The stories of the past had all been leading to one final chapter. The lineage of Abraham, the struggles of Noach, the patience of Yusuf, and the miracles of Isa were all like stars in a night sky, pointing towards a small city in the desert of Arabia called Mecca. Let's drift now to our final destination, to a man known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, who would bring the message of the garden back to a world that had almost forgotten its way home.
And so our long, sleepy journey across time brings us to the rugged, red rock landscape of Arabia. The world is in a strange place. The Roman and Persian empires are exhausted from endless wars, and the simple monotheism of Ibrahim has been buried under hundreds of idols inside the very Kaaba he built. It was as if humanity had fallen into a deep, confused slumber. In the city of Makkah, a boy was born into the noble tribe of Quraysh. His name was Muhammad, peace be upon him. But his story didn't start with golden cradles. He was born an orphan, never knowing his father and losing his mother at a young age. He grew up as a shepherd, tending flocks in the silent hills. There's something about the life of a shepherd, the patience, the solitude, the way you have to watch over things that can't speak for themselves, that seems to be the training ground for every great soul we've talked about tonight. As he grew, he became known as El-Amin, the trustworthy. In a city where trade was everything and deals were often shady, he was the one man everyone trusted. But even with a happy marriage to Khadija and a respected place in society, Muhammad felt a restlessness. He began to retreat to a small cave called Hira on the Mountain of Light. He wasn't looking for power, he was looking for answers. He was looking for the truth that Adam knew and that Isa had promised would return. One night during the month of Ramadan, the silence of the cave was shattered. The angel Jibril appeared, the same messenger who spoke to Maryam and Zachariah. He brought the first words of a new revelation. Read, in the name of your Lord who created. Muhammad came down from that mountain trembling. He didn't run to the marketplace to declare himself a king. He ran to his wife, Khadija, asking her to cover him in a cloak. It's the most human reaction to the divine, a need for warmth, for comfort, for someone to say, it's going to be okay. And she did. She became the first to believe, the first pillar of a message that would eventually reach every corner of the earth. For 13 years in Makkah, the message was simple. There is only one God, and we must care for the poor, the orphan, and the weak. But just like with Nuh, Hud, and Salih, the elite didn't like it. It threatened their business, their idols, and their egos. The early believers were boycotted, mocked, and tortured. But they had a peace that the powerful couldn't understand. Eventually, the migration to Medina, the Hijra, changed everything. The persecuted minority became a community. Muhammad wasn't just a preacher, he became a statesman, a mediator, and a father to a new nation. He built a society where a former slave like Bilal had the same standing as a noble. He taught that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, effectively dismantling the tribalism that had fueled wars for centuries. The climax of the story isn't a bloody battle, but the return to Mecca. After years of exile, Muhammad marched back into his home city with 10,000 followers. The people who had fought him for 2 decades expected a massacre. Instead, he stood before them and channeled the mercy of Yusuf. He asked them, "What do you think I will do to you?" They replied, "You are a noble brother." And he said, "Go, for you are free." He entered the Kaaba and one by one cleared out the idols. The house of Ibrahim was clean once more. The circle that began with Adam's first Alhamdulillah and Ibrahim's search for the stars had finally been completed. In his final sermon, standing on the plain of Arafat, the very place where Adam and Hawa had reunited so long ago, he told the people, "I have left among you that which, if you hold fast to it, you will never go astray, the book of Allah and my sunnah." He asked the crowd, "Have I delivered the message?" And 100,000 voices cried out, "Yes." Muhammad passed away peacefully in the arms of his wife, Aisha, leaving behind no gold, no silver, and no empires, just a book and a way of life. He was the final brick in the building of prophecy, the seal of the long line of men and women who had tried to remind us of who we are. And so we come to the end of our monologue. From the first sneeze of Adam to the final breath of Muhammad, the story of humanity is one long attempt to find our way back to that garden. It's a story of mistakes, of hammers and saws, of split seas and cooling fires, and ultimately of a mercy that never gives up on us. The lights are low now. The world is quiet. The history of the prophets is no longer a distant legend. It's the air we breathe and the ground we walk on. So sleep well. Rest in the knowledge that you are part of a story that is much bigger than your worries, a story that began in peace and, God willing, will end in peace. Now close your eyes. Today's story comes to an end here. Leave all your worries in Allah's care. May Allah grant you a peaceful night. Ameen. You were listening to Echoes of Islam After Dark. Thank you for resting with us. If you'd like more peaceful stories like this, save this video and stay connected with the channel. Assalamu Alaikum and good night.